I sometimes overlook things because I get in a different train of thought. So please bring it up on the chat. We will talk and address planned obsolescence. There's a great film about the light bulb that you can just Google. If you just Google light bulb and planned obsolescence, it's about a 30-minute documentary. It's really eye-opening about how light bulbs were initially created to have such a long use life, but they've been manufactured to have a short one because of the way that we want to grow our economy. So before I get started, because I know some of you just started today with joining us for a variety of reasons, I know sometimes the time isn't the best. I want to just share one thing that came to my mind because I've been having discussions with all my students for different things over the last couple of days. Classes started for me at Northeastern on Wednesday. But one thing that just, I never thought of it from this angle before until tonight. And it's perfectly makes sense. And I think it's so appropriate that we discuss it from this perspective since we're together on this topic. And that's how we look at climate change. You constantly hear people talk about CO2 emissions, but it's not the CO2 emissions that are the issue. It's the GDP. It's how we look at our economy that's the issue. We've been burning fossil fuels and things that cause CO2 emissions for thousands of years. But the thing is, we've never burned them at the rate that we're currently burning them at. So in a way, by constantly talking about CO2, or greenhouse gases, or global warming, or speed of climate change, we again are missing a wonderful opportunity to actually talk about the core issue, which is how we frame our economy, how we define economic growth. Because unless we actually change that, the anthropogenic impact, the human-made impact will continuously be there. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll continue to talk about that because Biden might unleash his or open up his new reform package. And I really think that one thing we're going to see is that in spite of the fact that he's going to perhaps be a greener president than his predecessor, he probably is still going to be heavily reliant on economic growth. And in being heavily reliant on economic growth, rather than using this juncture in human history as we know it to actually change the economic indicators that we use to measure our status, our well-being, he's going to miss that opportunity. So hopefully we can engage in that. So I'm going to share a few slides with you right now. And as I was saying when I was muted accidentally, I can't see the chat very well when I'm going through these slides. So please feel free to put your hand up if it's something you have a clarification about a specific moment. And that way Gabrielle and Corey can address that question to us. So these slides, as I mentioned, are quite simple. And they're quite simple because there's only two options here, complicated or simple. So they give me an opportunity to just speak to the issue. In economics, there is a concept of consumer behavior. And we actually call it the theory of the consumer. And the theory of the consumer is embedded with assumptions of what motivates people, what motivates our desires. There are two basic assumptions there: insatiable appetite to consume and a need for immediate gratification. So any of you who've taken an economics course probably remembers at a specific point in time where you look at measuring or maximizing an individual's utility subject to their income constraint. So in other words, all that we ever care to do is based on the income that we have, we try to maximize the amount that we can purchase. Inherent in this theory is that our happiness is derived based on how much we can buy, how much of our money we can spend for our gratification. So let's take just a second to pause here. How many of you have gone into a store looking to purchase one thing and left purchasing many more things than what you had intended? And how many of you felt in any way, shape, or form guilt for having done that? None of us, because we are preconditioned to believe that that is our right, that is actually the behavior that we should have as a member of society. And so we don't necessarily think about anything except whether the price is appropriate for our pocketbook, or even if it's not for our borrowing capacity. That's how we think. That's how we have been socialized. That's what I'm going to ask you in this next slide. And hopefully we can talk about this. Is this nature or is it nurture? Is it natural for us to be insatiable or appetites to consume, or is it truly related to the fact that we are socially constructed to be consumers? the argument is that we are socially constructed to be consumers. But if you really think about one thing that makes this really interesting, and it's a discussion I had with someone else about a slightly similar topic, is that it takes only one generation to separate our actions from the reason for those actions. Because we forget, we mimic the behaviors that we're surrounded by, but we don't necessarily know why those behaviors exist. We just assume that because they exist, that they're okay. So this is where that discussion of nature or nurture becomes complicated, because depending upon how many generations removed you are from the inception of consumerism, it may cloud your judgment as to whether or not that's your natural state. So in speaking to this, we can think about looking at other cultures. This is probably one of the areas where looking at other societies and traveling and seeing how other people behave based on material items can affect our perceptions of how we think of them in the United States up to a point. So I'll give you a simple story. When I was growing up, I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was about 2 years old. And my parents were very, very, very careful about the usage of paper. They made me use it front and back. The idea of throwing things away just did not even occur to them. But in school, I had been taught after I had finished using one side of the paper to throw it away, because that was the cultural norm. And my parents at home, it was a totally different norm. And that was because in the society that we came from, we conserved. We were in India, we conserved for a multitude of reasons, one being expense, but because the price actually embodied the fact that we were killing a living thing for temporary use. In the United States, looking at this particular graphic, we don't think about the living thing. In fact, because it's more convenient for us to do so, we have actually created a hierarchy of life where we sit at the very top and therefore feel justified in the marginalization of all other life, because it has less value, it has less feelings, it doesn't understand. But all those are human constructions based on one human framework of looking at the world, based on our sensory perceptions, which are very, very limited compared to those of any other species in some cases. We can't hear certain sounds that they can. We can't hear frequencies that they can. We can't make sounds like they do, that are so long ranging that organisms that are within their same species can hear over thousands of miles. We can't do a lot of things. But so to judge an animal within the scope of our framework purely for the use of it in terms of our exploitive use of it has become a norm in our society. And in some ways, our lack of questioning of that norm is part of the problem. So I invite you to think about that. I find it very interesting. Every now and then you see a new study coming out of a science journal that says trees can actually communicate with each other. Well, did you really think that that was a shock? I mean, don't you think that they would be able to communicate with each other? Probably the reason why we're not so understanding of that is because we keep chopping them down. We have the power of the axe, which is probably stronger than the power of their intercommunication. So I think one of the first steps that we can start to take is that all life has intrinsic value to itself, and all life will fight with whatever will it has, the capacity it has to live. And so when we think about consumption and we think about immediate gratification and insatiability, those aspects have to come into consideration, because obviously we must be in some way, shape, or form normalizing our ability to take life for our use through either cognitive dissonance or truly a belief that we have a right to do so. But in neither case, I would argue it's not nature, it's nurture. We have been taught not to critically evaluate the economic framework that we are brought up in, or the values that we're brought up in or come into face with due to the behaviors that we see around us, and we just absorb them. So when we're trying to talk about sustainability, the first thing I really hope, if there's something, a thought that I could put in the back of your mind to think about, when you look at and hear these different environmental policies or these pro-environmental stances, think to yourself, are they truly pro-environmental when they're only talking about the human being? When we talk about green technologies, they're only about maintaining human consumption levels, but having less emissions. They don't take into consideration the possibility that they may be harming other species. So are they really sustainable, or are they just less impactful to humans and still taking us down that same path that we don't want to be on, because we've come to the recognition that we have an interdependency with the ecosystem as a whole that we don't even completely understand. So that's just a thought process here. So it's me, in this particular case, the only theory that I'm telling you and sharing with you is the theory of the consumer, which has been what we call in economics endogenized into society. We teach it, marketing then promotes it, and then we live it. And it's become so intrinsic that that vicious cycle continues over and over again. And when we teach at the principles level, the first introductory course that most people take and the only course they take, we teach this as fact, not construction. So another major fact here that's a problem is the theory of the firm. And of course, it's all about maximization of profit. So I'm just going to stop here for 1 second, and then I'll go to a brighter colored slide, because I know when it's a dim slide, it's darker on my side. When we think about the theory of the firm, the fiduciary responsibility of a corporate entity, of the senior management team of a corporation, is defined by profit maximization, which means essentially cost minimization. Cost minimization means that I will do whatever I can to reduce the costs of my manufacturing or producing any good or service. That means I will pollute as long as there are no regulatory restrictions on that, even though intrinsically or innately I would know that polluting would harm people. Because the government doesn't say I can't do it, even though I know it's a problem, I'm still going to do it. That's a big issue right there. That's a lack of nurture, a lack of societal nurture of a common set of values that we all prescribe to because we want to make sure that we live in a society that promotes general well-being. We're only going to do what's required, not do what's in the best interests of all. That's the one element here that's the most important. So I'm just going to bring up two things. That one of them I brought up before. We all have heard of the divestiture movements related to promoting sustainability. Primarily, they've been related to fossil fuel-based companies. When you own stock, you are a voter in that stock. When you divest the stock, you let someone else take up your voting block or your voting capacity. When you have voting capacity, you have the opportunity to change the definition of fiduciary responsibility for a company. A corporate CEO has no incentive to adopt sustainability if it's going to lessen profits and if profits are what stakeholders want. If the shareholder wants profits and you're going to adopt sustainability, you're going to be out of a job. But if the shareholder is saying we want the job description changed so it incorporates sustainability, now you are working towards the shareholder's goals. This is where the disconnect in the logic of divestiture exists. So if you have the opportunity to change the compensation scheme of the CEO to align it to sustainability, then you have given him the right to pursue sustainability because it is his job. And the other way that we can also do this, we can institute this through our consumer status as an individual or a citizen, is buying based on brand value related to sustainability. So in other words, I buy companies, buy shares of companies as an investor, buy products of companies as a consumer, and give brand premium to being sustainable. So those are two elements where our money can actually help promote the changes we're seeking, our consumer behavior as an investor and a consumer. When we divest, we're divesting to make ourselves feel good, but we're really not making a difference in the world. Divestiture has not been proven to be successful for anything, although it's often discussed with regard to apartheid in the past. Apartheid fell not because of divestiture movements, but because the governments finally could not handle the adverse impacts to its economy based on the ramifications related to divestiture. In other words, the negative negative perceptions towards South Africa. The loss of investors' holdings didn't push the government forward. So I think it's really important to also look back at the literature and see the causal forces. The marketing, the engagement with regard to sustainability to change fiduciary duty would probably make a much more lasting long-term impact. So this is the part that's the most fascinating, that ties the whole thing together. All of us have consumed chocolate. Probably very few of us recognize and know that that chocolate is coming from slave labor, and child slave labor at that. These are headlines from the Washington Post. The most recent is the one that says Supreme Court weighs child slavery case. That was in December of last year. The other two are in the last 2 years. So these are cases, these are articles that have been written about. Unfortunately, most people in the United States still are not aware of. But this is where our consumption choices change the economic model. So the theory of the consumer is that we have insatiable appetites to consume. Well, we can start to consume based on our values. So insatiability could be tied, not necessarily to having more, but having goods that are aligned to the world that we want to be a part of. So we have to think about the chocolate we buy. In terms of the supply chain for the producer, for the theory of the firm is looking to cost minimize. That's why they're using this labor. That's why they also want to continue to be able to use this labor. That's why you're able to buy your chocolate cheap. The same thing goes. We can change that theory of the firm by making the supply chain something that the firm is held accountable to, either through our brand proposition that we only purchase things where we have a transparent supply chain, or through both together, or demanding that the CEO and the C-suite that run the company incorporate supply chain responsibility as part of their job description. So this is just a simple tangibility example, but one that unfortunately is still so poorly known and disclosed. So every day we actually exacerbate this. For any of you that are interested, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded a couple of years ago to two people. One of them was Denis Mukwege. I might be saying his name incorrectly, so forgive me there, but you can look it up through the website for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is a gynecologist in the Congo, and he gave his speech in French, but there are subtitles in English. At the very beginning of his speech, there is a segment of it where he says, "I come from one of the richest nations in the world, but we are among the poorest. My people are among the poorest." And this has to do with the supply chain. This has to do with us. So when we talk about supply and demand only come up with prices that are exploiting somebody unless both partners are at the same level, have transparent information, have equal resources. But we don't trade with countries that have equal resources because we want to be able to make more, sell more, have more profit. And for that reason, we're responsible for the exploitation of those that are desperate to have something, because we don't put fairness and equity in our decision making with them. We take advantage of their ignorance and we take advantage of their poverty. So poverty, again, just as we've noted before, is a social construction, but it is a social construction that is based on our belief that we have insatiable appetites. So this is a very simple example of what we need, what I'm trying to advocate for. We live in what's called a cradle to grave society. Things come in, natural resources, we extract, we design, we produce, we package, and then we dispose. Very few things are reused. Very few things are recycled, because at the point of their production, they were not designed for recycling. To bring up a point that was sent in to me, they were designed for obsolescence. They were designed for the dump, because that's the only way to keep the growth of the economy going. If they're designed to be reused, then the manufacturer will go out of business, right? After he or she hits a certain point of sale. because people don't need it anymore. We don't design for the idea of fair returns. We design for the idea of perpetual returns based on probably a socially manifested or engineered view that greed is good, which comes from a movie, I hear. So cradle to cradle is what we're actually trying to promote in the society. So I just want to talk about two things here that might be of interest to you to think about. Cradle to cradle means that when I produce so that when the end of life comes, a new life begins. We really have no products on the market that are cradle to cradle because they never were designed to be. The design of your phone, your phone is designed to only last until you pay for it, right? Then it's gone. I mean, but could we probably have a phone that had the ability to be enhanced by new technology? Probably. And it would probably cost less and probably be less resource intensive. So one of the major reasons why we don't have this is because we don't demand it as consumers. So it could be incorporated in our production model. It would affect GDP because we couldn't have a growth-oriented economy. But this is a perfect point given our discussion of last week. Do we really need growth in order to have well-being? And I'm hoping you're all seeing that you don't. Well-being is not about how much you have, it's about the quality of what you have. And it's about the balance of what you have. And our measurement is only about quantity. So it's very much of a disconnect between true human sensory perception of well-being. So that's why this is saying right here, we need an alternative measure. We need a paradigm shift. Right now is like the perfect time for that paradigm shift. So I made a comment about Biden's administration moving to green, and great today they've just been an announcement that I think the Dakota pipeline has been X'd out, right? I think that just came through the news a few minutes ago. But you also hear people talking constantly about how the green future, the green economy will create new jobs. We really are at a point in time in our history where we have to start to think about, do we really need to keep on thinking about new job creation, or can we start to think about shrinking the economy and understanding that some people are going to be displaced during this time period? It's going to be uncomfortable. But to continue to believe that we can maintain this population and continue to allow it to grow is inconsistent with reality. So this whole idea of green business is that somehow we move people from the fossil fuel industry to solar and wind and other types of green technologies such as hydro and other things. But all of that still is resource intensive. It's still profit maximizing. It's still consumption driven. So I would like you to think and hear your thoughts on the idea of maybe this is the time that we give severance checks. We allow people to have early retirement. We just say that, look, these jobs are not going to continue to grow. We've got to change how we consume. We've got to start to think about conservation and reduction of use. We've got to think about reduction of dependence on energy because of the impact that it has. And we've got to think about exiting the concept of planned obsolescence to starting to create products that last a lifetime and beyond that lifetime. So this is where I'm making my little pitch of an example after this slide to Sustainable Practices, the organization that I am very privileged to have started and to lead. What we try to do on the Cape is we use this life cycle in a product form that's tangible to almost everybody, with the hope that we are teaching the impact of life cycle consumption. And the very simple element is it's a petroleum-based product when people are talking about fossil fuel impacts, and it goes on to being a product that leaches chemicals because it was never tested to be consumed. And then so it causes all kinds of health effects here. And then it goes on to the disposal stage, which lasts in excess of its use value. all of these are qualitative. For the question that I received related to quantitative expenses, the problem is once you start to get into the discussion of the numbers behind each one of these, like some people like to ask very cleverly, what is the life cycle impact in dollars? Well, dollars don't matter here because, as I mentioned to you before, the market has already inefficiently priced everything through here. So if I get in the weeds of talking about the dollars, we're missing the bigger point, which on a qualitative basis, I can express to you very clearly and all of you can see very easily. This is 5 to 10 minutes of use life. This is thousands of years of damage. Tell me, isn't that a simple story? Do we really need numbers to explain that? So that is where we're trying to move people to think, is from the qualitative aspect. The numbers are too easy to manipulate. And if you leave one segment of this life cycle out, you can get a completely different evaluation between paper and plastic. As some of you already probably have seen, that there are reports out there that tell you that plastic bags have a lower environmental impact than paper bags. What they are not considering is the life cycle, end of life cycle use impact. So today and on the last couple of days that we've met, we've actually been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wanted to bring this slide up because they are coming. Their target date for the Sustainable Development Goals is 2030, which is 9 years from now. And we are so far behind. The primary focus of the Sustainable Development Goals is poverty alleviation, or elimination, I should say, the elimination of poverty on this planet. Of course, they're using a dollar value for that, and all these other impacts follow from that. But what we've been talking about today is Sustainable Development Goal number 12. Sustainable Development Goal number 12 is responsible consumption and production. What we talked about last time when we met was Sustainable Development Goal number 8 to some extent, which is decent work and economic growth. When we look at reframing our GDP, these two are extremely tied together. And I did put out a book on SDG 8 that came out in 2019. I will have one coming out on SDG 12, hopefully a little later this year. I only share that with you should you want to read it. I'm happy to share it with you. I only have a PDF, but I'm happy to share. But the reason for this is in both of these discussions, there are anomaly impacts. They are all interrelated, and you can't start working on one without affecting all the others. So I'm hoping as we continue the last 3 sessions that we have, that we will start to touch on all the others. But as a segue to the next one that we will talk about, I wanted to end with this particular slide because I want to talk about number 4, which is quality education. And the primary reason for that is I want you to all just for 1 second to define in your minds to yourselves what you think education is. What is the purpose of education? And Noam Chomsky has a nice 20-minute clip. Any of you can Google him and just type in purpose of education. And you can listen to that because he has a good but slow discussion on it. But actually my interests precede the Noam Chomsky clip. I only found that myself a few days ago when I was looking for some resources for my class. But what do you think the purpose of education is? When we start to actually think about that one subject, it's really the reason for all the other issues that we face. It ties into everything. To the extent that we only teach people what they need to know to exist in the society as it is, we eliminate the questioning of why the society operates this way. And we also eliminate the ability for people to perceive a world that could be different. So that's why I often come up with people coming up to me and telling me, saying things, well, things can't be different. This is how this is the nature of the situation. This is how people are. That I would say majority of it is because of this. And just like parenting that we're seeing, like we ended the conversation with last week, we are seeing that COVID has actually helped us understand the limitations of our education. Too many of us require stimulus to come from the outside in. rather than having had the education to know how to stimulate ourselves from the inside out. So we have to really start to think about what education is. Is it education for vocation, or is it education for society? Those are two different things. They can be connected, but right now they stand as very separate things, where only vocation is the primary purpose. Income generation is the primary purpose of education. So it ties to this whole idea of production in a consumption economy. With that, I am stopping the slides, and I'm hoping that we can I hope this was somewhat interesting to you, and we can talk about a few other things that you might find interesting as well. Thank you.
All right, so now we are to the Q&A portion of tonight. Before we get into that, we want to send out the Google poll for everyone. So in your chat, you should be getting, that is the Google poll, right? Yep. In the chat, you'll see the Google poll. If you'd like to take that at the end of tonight, you're more than welcome to, but tomorrow I'll also send it out to you in our email that'll have the next Zoom link and further materials. But for all of you who have everything fresh in your mind, that might be a cool way to do it. So now the way we did it, like last week, is if you have a question, send it in to me and you could just say, I have a question, and then I'll call on you and then we'll move forward. Sound good? The first one we got coming in is from Brian. So Brian, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Oops. Okay, thank you. Actually, I had two questions, both on the same idea of measurement. The first was, you mentioned the need to shift metrics to support sustainability. And I wondered if you could speak about how those metrics could be adapted, what changes we need. And then the second is sort of the same idea, but at the micro level. You talked about the profit maximization theory of the firm does not incorporate broader values into the goal of the firm, like equity or environmental impact. And I wondered if you could suggest ways that the theory of the firm or the goal of a firm could be modified to incorporate broader goals like those sustainability goals that you mentioned.
I'm going to start with the second one first, because actually it's the easier of the two. But specific to the firm, there are multiple channels to actually promote change with regard to how a firm behaves. One could very much simply be related to a new ranking device. Some of you may be familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI. When firms report that information out, it actually it comes out of a questionnaire base, which in answering the question, it actually changes the way the company may perceive itself, which is one way. And because it is a ranking device and it gives a numerical score, actually gives a letter grade score to the firm may have an aspirational goal to see that grade improve. That's one. But also on top of that is the rise of the ESG or the SRI or sustainable investing in general, and the premium that those companies that are considered to be sustainable, or ESG, which is environment, social and governance. Forgive me, I always get the S one mixed up here. So you might want, if anybody want to correct me, go ahead and please put it in the chat. But ESG is actually coming out of self-reported information, just like the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. But the issue with the funds is that they are all proprietary, which means that every fund uses different criteria to judge what they consider to be sustainable, but they're all pretty similar, not too different. But Brian, to your point, those external pressures can cause the firm, because of its own desire to be ranked in a certain way or perceived in a certain way, to start changing. In the same way that people's consumption behavior can also affect a firm. It's the uninformed element of people's consumption behavior that is the risk, though, because you know that Coca-Cola has come out with by stating that it's using natural or non-synthetic or organic elements in its plastic, as though somehow that effectively eliminates all of the adverse impacts of waste, and it's not true. So the lack of the informed consumer continues to be one of the major limitations for using the consumer channel to make change. So that is one of the reasons why we, as in my nonprofit, focus on that educational channel, because once you do that, then you've created a permanent change. You've changed the way people perceive the world. So those are the only ways that I can think of. The economic theory itself isn't going to be the change agent, the catalyst. It's going to have to be the economic agents forcing the change in the economy. So right now, for all practical purposes, we've lived in a system that has formed us. We have been formed by it. What we have to now do is, because the people who were in this society before us didn't, is we have to reform the system from the bottom up. Because the system is there for us. It's just now that it's forgotten that it's about us. And we have forgotten that we control it. So I think that's where the difficulty lies. To go back to your first question with regard to what kind of indicators we can use, it comes with the understanding of the general public that we have been nurtured to overconsume. So stop. That's number one. And then automatically when that happens, the GDP is going to go down, okay? Because it's consumption driven. So that means that in this interim period where people are going to feel lost because the indicators that we have used are no longer going to function, that's when we can pull back and say we want to measure well-being. It is not going to be a smooth transition because we don't have a homogeneous population in terms of their understanding of why the changes need to be made. And I think that's very clear from this last election, because even though many people may have been happy about whoever was sworn in a couple of days ago, there were many, many people who were very upset by it too. So the biggest obstacle we have right now is ourselves, is the patience to speak with our neighbor that disagrees with us, and to speak not to change his mind, but to find the common ground between the two of us. It's a totally different conversation than my saying to you, you're wrong for thinking this way. It's more of my saying to you, this is the world that we both want. Let's see how we can work to get there together. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but in the few minutes that I have on Zoom, that's probably the closest I can get.
Thank you so much. Madhavi, I wanted to add just very quickly a comment because one of the things that some of our participants may not know. So Corey and I mentioned that we're part of the Blue Marble Librarians group, which is a group of librarians that work on issues related to sustainability and climate change, which is how Madhavi and our group got to do this program. But one of the things that I'm involved in is the right to repair movement and repair events. And so I'm currently working on a chapter for the American Library Association, because in 2019, the American Library Association established sustainability as one of its core values. And so they are putting out a book in the next year or so about sustainability. So one of the things that I have been able to work on is a chapter about repair events. And I also contributed to a book which is called Repair Revolution: How Fixers Are Transforming Our Throwaway Culture. And I'll put a link to that book in the chat, but I just wanted to throw that in really quickly right here, simply because I think that one of the things that I feel like is an intersection here is this is a concrete, talking to Madhavi's point about how bringing people together and finding shared and common values. And if for anybody who may not be familiar with repair events, I'm not going to extrapolate too much, but basically, right, looking at that supply chain, how do we create a culture and how do we create, value systems in which people repair their broken things? So repair events, repair cafes, fix-it clinics, this is a grassroots movement that started in 2009, and it's a way in which people are trying to make these values, make this concrete. So I just wanted to quickly put that in, and then I wanted to, go to the next question, which is going to be from Lily. So Lily, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, we are ready for you.
Hi, mine wasn't actually a question. I just, the last fall, I started participating with the Slow Factory. I'm really interested in fashion, and the greener, the better. And they actually have a really wonderful open education forum, and anybody can go. You can register for these classes. And it's not just about fashion. There are aspects that focus on green fashion, what greenwashing is, how to make your own clothes, but some of it just focuses on things like how to do sustainable cocoa manufacturing so you don't have to feel bad about getting your chocolate fixed and things like that. So I just wanted to share that because it's really interesting. I find it really useful. And if you have the money, you can support making these classes available for other people. So
Thank you so much, Lily. And the next question we have.
Carlin has her hand up. I think it's been up for a little while. So can we go to her, Gabrielle?
Yes, and I also see that Mallory had a question as well. So I want to make sure.
Yeah, I'll wait for Mallory. She was probably first.
Okay. Mallory, you're up.
Hi, thanks. I have a quick question. I'm curious what you think about sort of the emissions increase that has happened around since the 1950s and kind of what you think changed maybe in how we see consumption since then, or if you think that didn't really matter.
No, it's a perfect question, and it ties directly to the use of the global indicator of GDP. So in the 1930s, GDP is created not directly as GDP. It's created through what we call the national income accounts. And then after that, that was created by Simon Kuznets, and it's primarily because after going through the Depression, the government really wanted to be able to understand the production levels in this country so that we could centralize and ensure that we could always produce as much as we needed for our population as one channel of determining potential well-being. But because of the World War II and then the desire to help reframe the global economy, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and a bank that would eventually become an arm of the World Bank were created. And the US was very dominant at that particular time. So that's how the US economic indicators became global economic indicators. So at that point, we were still at GNP. We were measuring gross national product. The GDP became our indicator in the 1990s, in the 1990 timeframe. That becomes a common indicator that we think about today. But going back to the 1950s, consumerism, and that's often talked about in this other video called, oh goodness, why can't I remember? The Story of Stuff. They bring it up in terms of planned obsolescence and the desire to create and promote retail growth. And that's fine. But the reason why that it all occurred was because now we were measuring our economy based on consumption. So, planned obsolescence was perfect. And it could give it, we could all give it a gold star because it actually promoted our need to consume over and over again, need to purchase over and over again. So definitely, I would go back a little earlier though. I would say the 1940s are where this really starts. The 1950s is when it takes off. And the reason why it takes off is what we probably need to understand a little bit more. We need to understand what was it about the American psyche? What was it about this emerging middle class that unquestioningly decided that it would partake in this enormity of consumption available to it without question? Because that to me tells us everything that we do is based about behavior, and behavior is related to our sense of security, inferiority, insecurity, hierarchy, how we're made to feel in a society. And when we're really looking for the cure, even today it's applicable. Why is it that many people, when they need a fix, go shopping? Right? It is a psychological tool that has been manifested within our system as that is what you do when you want to feel better. So we need to understand where that entered into our system, where having things became synonymous with love, where having things became synonymous with being a good person. We need to understand that. I can give you a couple of potential channels, but the complexity of it is so much greater because it hasn't gone in a linear fashion. Each generation has adopted it for different reasons. I hope that helps a little.
Excellent. And then Carolyn, I think that you were next for your question.
And then Marietta has her physical hand up.
Thank you. It sounds like, so we have a couple of, well, I have another thought of what other people are talking about with Gabrielle talking about the right to repair and then slow factory. It almost sounds like one option is to start building the size of the informal economy that we participate in. That might be another course of action that we could take. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, an informal economy is just one that's not necessarily a market-based economy. It can still be very resource intensive. It doesn't necessarily have to have less resource use. So reuse is associated with lower resource use because you're just reusing the same thing, fixing it, having the right to repair it. So you just have to only incorporate the new elements that are potentially broken or obsolete. I would rather use the thought terminology or the thought process that we seek to reduce our footprint, because that is the value, and so that would be my response.
Absolutely. And was it Marietta, did you say, had her hand up?
Yeah.
Yes. So I would tell me if I'm understanding this right. So GDP it measures consumption, but only consumption of manufactured things. Where do services fit into the money that goes around in our society? Like somebody, a professor or a physician or a repair person, a plumber or electrician, somebody who provides a service. Is the money that they generate not counted in the GDP?
Yes, it is. It is counted because GDP is basically the sum of all goods and services at a specific point in time, produced and consumed at a specific point in time, because you're getting the expenditure value. You're getting what you're looking at, the amount of that production that was actually purchased. So the salaries of these individuals are captured. They're captured in the consumption values. So we went over this last week, and I hope that we have the materials so we could probably send them to you.
Yes. Yeah.
But basically, GDP is a simple equation of C plus I plus G plus X minus N. What that means is it's consumption spending plus investment spending, which is investment on property, plant, and equipment. Think of it from that perspective. Things that actually help create production in the economy. And that's the I. And then G is your government spending, which should be equal to the tax revenue collected. And then exports minus imports, obviously what you sell abroad relative to what you import in. The majority component of GDP in the United States is consumption spending, around 65 to 70%. There is an easy way to find this value. If you go to the Federal Reserve, and when the Federal Reserve puts out their release, and before we all leave, by the 6th class, we are going to go over the Federal Reserve press release, because I want you to know that you can read this and understand exactly what it's saying. And it's very important to me that you do. It's basically everything that we talked about in this class. They just do it in a very convoluted form, but you can read through the lines with me and you'll know exactly what I mean when I'm saying that once we get to the class number 6. So with regard to that, Marietta, the personal consumption expenditures, the PCE, that's what you want to look at in terms of looking at the proportion of a consumption in the US economy. And that's released on a routine basis.
So how would we measure our economy if we all stopped buying things, but we still, like we drew pictures and read books and went for walks and became healthier and happier? What measurement tool would there be for that?
Well, first of all, if I can just backtrack and say this indicator that we use has only been in existence since the 1930s. So we didn't measure our economy like this before. So that's number one. This is just a production measure. This just tells us how much we can produce. The problem with this indicator is that we have used it to tell us what to use it as a proxy or a synonym for standard of living, of well-being, of a hierarchy of economic status, of a country's wealth. It's not, because we're not all equally partaking in the benefits of that growth.
Mm.
It's a very poor indicator of that. All it's telling us is how much we can produce. And given that it can be changed and modified just by government spending, it can be highly manipulated. I would like you to, if you have a chance, this is not meant to say that China manipulates, but just to get an example of how easy it is to manipulate GDP growth through government spending. There is an old frontline video that you can Google. It's called China's Ghost Cities. And I think it's a little bit enjoyable to watch from the standpoint it explains, you can see picked in visuals the impact of government spending on making a country look as though it's growing when it may not necessarily be doing so. So ghost cities, China's ghost cities. But right now, the problem is that we have, for the general lay person who's not been told or thought or has had the opportunity to sit back and think, what does progress mean? They've been sold this idea that somehow our wealth is based on how much we produce. And so we have a lot of education to do, but we can do it really quickly. And a new indicator that we could use, there are many of them that have been created. The one that has perhaps the potential for the greatest traction is the United Nations Human Development Index, the UN HDI. And it was another Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, has his stamp on that one. There's a couple others. There's the Gross National Happiness Index that was created out of Bhutan. State of Vermont has adopted that. I haven't really looked at that indicator for a while, but it actually measures through a survey how people living in a particular place feel in terms of their happiness. It measures it's a long survey from what I remember. I think it takes 6 hours to complete from the survey taker comes in. So maybe you might not be quite so happy at the end of it. But the point is that there are many other ways. And the primary reason why most of the times those other ways are discounted is because they're thought of, oh, they're subjective values and we need objective values. Well, income is a subjective value too. We just think that somehow numbers make things appear more factual for some reason, but feelings are too. You just need to test people's sentiments over a larger pool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question is from Jan. Jan, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Basic problem is our appetite for growth. The word growth is important, and I have been back in the 60s was involved with looking at population and its interface with changes in the environment, for example, and I was a member of that now infamous group, I guess, Zero Population Growth. Since then, I've seen the population of the triple, and it's still moving up. Now, fortunately, we do see that about 40 countries have, because of declining birth rates, some since World War II, even in spite of increased longevity, which I think is a good thing, have stable population. And my concern that I bring up today is the fact that the Brookings Institution report that just came out, written by a guy named William Frey, F-R-E-Y, in Boston, for the Brookings Institution, looks at this big picture of population and sees that the declining birth rate is looking at the reduction of the growth of the population and calls that stagnation. So what should we do about stagnation, he says? Well, he has a variety of ways of dealing with that. From my perspective, as a truly, positive thing that we could be doing that I think would really raise people's understanding is to celebrate this so-called stagnation, to celebrate the reduction, because everyone, especially in the US, given our great appetite for use of resources, have dramatic negative impact on the environment, the more people that we have. and the more natural resources that we consume and destroy. So let's celebrate stagnation. What do you think?
Well, I would be happier even with grosser reduction. How about that?
Reduction.
I sort of gave my controversial opinion at the end of our last discussion. So those people who were with us that time, I would really love to know if any of them thought about that and if they feel any agreement towards my comments. But for those of you that may not have been with us, I basically said that, you know, children are a positive externality to society if they're raised well. In other words, they give positive benefits to the world if they are properly raised. So therefore, we shouldn't be valuing income. We should be valuing proper parenting when we think about children. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes you see this trade-off between how much a person makes and how much they're losing because they have to stay home and raise their child. But as a society, if we were to recognize that that child being raised properly is a benefit to us all, then we should be honoring the people who actually do a good job and perhaps taxing those that don't. Maybe that's what we do. But I say that in jest, but I actually mean it in a way too. It's just a very complex issue to figure out how you would levy that tax. But perhaps maybe that would make people less inclined to have frivolous procreation.
So the next question is going to be from Sandy. I see that your hand is raised, so.
Thank you. My name's Clara. This is Sandy. I read an article quite a long time ago about consumerism in colonial Williamsburg. And I'm seeing all these graphs that show this incredible rise starting at the 1950s or 40s. And the discussion about GDP being created. But I've also seen so many examples in history of extractive consumer, depleting resources in the colonial era. And I was wondering, even though the graphs do really start to take off at that time, do you not see this as some sort of an intrinsic human tendency that is in fact a lot older, and maybe just wealth allowed it to skyrocket at that time, incredible wealth and infrastructure?
I would, from my vantage point, I see it two different ways. One, yes, it is intrinsic in certain cultures, not all cultures, because the type of extraction and production that we're talking about requires the exploitation of one person or one group for the benefit of the other. Not all societies have had that. Unfortunately, by their very definition, those societies that don't have that would be the ones that would be eliminated because they would tend to be the ones that would be exploited, right? That's number one. But I agree with you that there has always been a certain amount of exploitation, and we can look back and we can see history that shows us Easter Island, for example, is the reason why there's no habitation there is an outcome of desertification related to deforestation, used for simply the purpose of putting those giant monuments, at least that's what we're thinking, into the ground. So we know that deforestation in Rome led to a lack of water, desertification there, so movement, elimination of populations in certain areas. So yes, definitely. But let's think about the cultural attributions that perhaps led some cultures to be more damaging or degrading to the environment relative to others. We are an outcome of Western civilization. We are an outcome of that particular strain of history. So that we would mimic it would not be a big surprise to me. But the speed at which we started to increase in the 1940s has a lot to do with it being the target. Prior to that, it wasn't an organized target. You would have exploitation, but in pockets. It wasn't done with the idea of it having to continue year after year after year. It was just done to the point of satiation at that point in time. And it wasn't done with the idea of planned obsolescence, that you would have to continue to use more resources because you always have to replace and trash. So that part was missing. And I think that is the part of our consumer economy today that's leading to our demise. Consumption in and of itself doesn't have to be a bad thing. An iron skillet lasts perhaps hundreds of years, right? But we don't think about having the nicest and the best quality. We just think about having the shiniest and brightest that conforms to the fashion of the day. I think that's where the disconnect is probably the most apparent between the past and the present in terms of exploitive behavior.
Well, it wouldn't be so much the iron skillet. It would be like the lace, the silk ruffles and the sugar and the rum, maybe.
Sugar and rum could be degrading up to a point. I guess the pervasiveness of the use of those products would have to be one of the elements. So if people,
No, where they come from, the West Indies.
But you're
The
talking
exploitation.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking about environmental degradation, because it all depend on how much is consumed. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we only have, I think we have about 3 more questions, and we try to keep it to about an hour because we started a little late. So I see that April has a question. If April, you would like to unmute yourself, please feel free to right now.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel that, a healthy environment and education for a healthy environment is really important. But what I've been noticing is that people are not given the information, or you have to be in the know, like you have to be part of a trade organization. For example, I just recently learned that this chemical PFAS is being used and has been used for quite a while in product packaging, like for fast foods, like French fries and pizza boxes and takeout containers. And that's to allow that the grease doesn't get all over the consumers. But I mean, I didn't know this was going on, and how many other people are buying these products, right? And not even realizing this is happening. And this information is so, I feel like it's so secret. Like you have to belong to every trade organization in order to make the right choices for, to protect your health and to protect the environment, because, people buy these foods, this fast foods, and they'll throw the packaging out in the ground, and then this chemicals go into the ground and into the water. So, I mean, what can we do to become more educated? I mean, how can we kind of tune in to these very, I don't know, elusive things that happen in our environment, in our packaging, and in our foods?
Just to go back to PFAS, for example, PFAS has been around because of Teflon more so than anything else. The pervasiveness is associated with that. And there's a great film for any of you who may not have seen it. It's The Devil We Know, and it's the history of this particular product. If I could just make one little statement with regard to that, PFAS is one of many chemicals. So your other point, I think, is the one that we as a society have to really focus on, is understanding our knowledge, or having greater transparency of the impacts of these chemicals. But it goes back to 2 things. Our GDP focus, based on it being a proxy for growth, well-being, all of these things, have actually made us a very pro-business government, because being a pro-business government actually helps us with the GDP growth, right? They're tied.
Yeah.
So pro-business means that fundamentally we're not pro-consumer, because you can't be both, unfortunately, in this case. That means the speed to market trumps human impact, which leads to a situation where litigation is our only mechanism to change and protect ourselves. So when you talk about what can we do, we are 3 things. Every one of us on this Zoom call, we are consumers, we are investors, and we are members of the government. When we elect somebody into office, we are electing them to take the oversight of our protection, of our general welfare. That's what they're supposed to do when they take the oath of office, when they swear to abide by uphold the Constitution. How many of us vote on people where we actually know that their values are aligned with upholding the Constitution? That's where we fail. We can't know everything, but the person you elect into office, he or she is elected into office to know what we can't, because we have time restrictions on learning every aspect of the life that we are a part of. And to the point that we have made marketing, just as we buy our consumer products, the mechanism of determining who we are going to vote for, we have disenfranchised ourselves from the proper way or mechanism of exercising that vote. So that would be my response, April. I believe that that channel is there. We cannot correct the wrongs that currently exist by the snap of a finger, because it's been an intergenerational distancing from that kind of responsibility. But I do believe if we're patient and we tackle this one at a time, we can effectively change the status of elected office to one that actually deserves respect rather than one that demands it.
Thanks.
So I see that we have MJ and then Lily and then Jane, and that will be it for questions. MJ, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can do so now. I think MJ might have. You still here? Nope. Lily, did you want to ask a question?
No, I was yet again just throwing my opinion and comments out there to the wind. So my apologies.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So that would mean that Jane is last. Jane, if you're still here, please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, thank you. And I'm a latecomer both tonight and to your series. I hope to continue to join. I wondered if you'd already commented either earlier tonight or earlier in your series about the activities that are not given dollar values but are tremendously important. And you alluded to that when you talked about good parenting, where we don't pay people who do their own housekeeping, or we don't pay people that take care of their own family members, and yet those aspects of the caring economy are absolutely critical to keeping society going. So where does that fit in terms of an economics?
That's the problem with GDP. GDP does not factor in unpaid work, and to the extent that we have proxied value based on the market, based on income that people receive, we fundamentally have made unpaid work unvaluable work.
So no volunteer work is counted, despite
No.
the fact that there's a tremendous amount of volunteer work, even outside of the home.
No, and nothing is calculated. We did talk about this last time, but what all that is calculated is anything that's in the market. So as I mentioned at the very end, the person who smokes, drinks a lot, gets divorced a few times, has to go to the hospital for multiple surgeries, he or she has a lot more value to the economy than the person who eats right, exercises, takes care of their family, loves their children, takes time away from work to help them go to Little League and all those other things. That person has less value in our economic system because they contribute less to it overall.
And then that's probably related to why we don't value the environment as much for the unpaid functions that the environment does to help us. For example, the natural cycle of water cleaning or air cleaning by forests, or water cleaning as the water goes through the different layers of the soil and gets purified. Those sorts of functions aren't valued, but the land is valued if it can be developed and you can get money out of it somehow.
That wouldn't be necessarily because of GDP. It would be because of a reliance on humans to value something that they would then have to pay for. Because the earth is silent, it is not an actual participant in the economic system. It requires us to give it fair value. And to the extent that giving it fair value reduces profits, we only do what's necessary based on regulation, which is often slow to perceive the need to provide value to the ecosystem. So it's a failure on the human side to actually give fair value. It's taking advantage of the silence of the environment, I would say, more so than anything else.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
The vulnerable only have the strong as their advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as the strong are motivated by their own self-interests, vice will always trump virtue. That's the society we live in.